Howdy. This is my essay entitled, Shocking New Proof That Trees Can Solve the Carbon Dioxide Problem. This essay is for you if you might be interested in solving the carbon dioxide problem in the atmosphere, and if you might have grown tired of seeing an obscene amount of money being spent on climate change without any reduction in the amount of carbon dioxide in our air. Let me begin by explaining that I am not a climate denier. I actually believe that excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will eventually cause human extinction unless the problem might be fixed. Seriously, only an idiotic dotard is going to deny the factual reality that a greenhouse gas is going to cause a greenhouse effect. So, with that said, there was a recent study that helps to shed light on climate change. A group of climate scientists identified hundreds of plots of land inside forests in Sweden, and then they actually went out into the forest and they got down on their knees and they measured all the carbon they could find, down to 1 meter in depth. They analyzed the dead trees and the living trees and the branches and the sticks and the leaves and the roots and the fruit and the soil and the entire ecosystem of the forest. They were comparing the carbon inside new forests versus the carbon inside old forests. This is a shocking study, mostly because it might be, and it probably is, the first time that climate scientists did a real-life, hands-on measurement of all the carbon they could find from multiple locations in a forest, comparing old forests to new forests. You see, climate scientists have spent the last few decades downplaying trees, ignoring trees, convincing us that trees cannot solve the problem, telling us that it is okay to burn wood because allegedly trees are sustainable. But we finally have a respected and unassailable group of climate scientists who actually ventured inside a forest and performed actual measurements on carbon with the intention of discovering the truth about trees and forests and carbon sequestration. And they proved that there is a shocking amount of carbon stored inside old forests, especially the soil of old forests. Over the last few decades, climate scientists would not use real-world numbers when talking about the carbon inside forests. Instead, they would just guess about the amount of carbon in the trees, and then they would make a very conservative estimate and then plug their small numbers into computer models. The reason why climate scientists make such low guesses about carbon in a forest is explained in my documentary movie called What the Foresting Forest Are Climate Scientists Thinking? Please go watch my movie. It is free on the YouTube site. My movie is beautifully written, delightfully funny, and I even include a few climate scientist jokes. Now, I like this new tree study about forests in Sweden because in several respects it proves that what I said in my documentary is correct. I should point out that this new tree study was published several weeks after I made my movie. In other words, humbly speaking, I said it first. This new climate study about trees in Sweden was filled with blah, 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 scientific tiddlywinks, and numbers. The specific details are not important, but the conclusions are monumentally critical for understanding of climate change. To the credit of the climate scientists who did this new Sweden tree study, after proving that old forests contained a considerable amount of carbon, they admitted something else about carbon sequestration with a shocking amount of climate honesty. Sit down, pay attention to this. This point right here is monstrously momentous and propitious. As it turns out, there is so much carbon inside an old forest, and especially inside the soil of an old forest, that if Sweden were to allow all of her new forests to grow over time and become old forests, there would be such a phenomenal amount of carbon dioxide sequestration that Sweden could erase 150% of her fossil fuel emissions since the start of the Industrial Revolution. You heard that correctly. In 2026, a legitimate and academic and scientific climate study actually admitted that we can solve the atmospheric carbon dioxide problem by growing old forests. This renegade group of climate scientists went entirely off script when they confessed that trees can solve the problem. They revealed something that was not supposed to be part of the official climate movement narrative. It was an orgiastic exclamation of irrepressible truth. We really can erase the excess carbon dioxide emissions by planting and managing young trees and growing those young trees and keeping them alive until they become an old forest. We now have scientific proof that trees can solve the problem. Let me repeat, trees can solve the problem. Please note that this estimate of sequestering 150% of Sweden's fossil fuel emissions was only an analysis of existing new forests being allowed to grow into old forests. If Sweden were to go out there and plant more trees and create more new forests, then even more carbon sequestration could take place. If Sweden could do it, so could the United States and Canada and Russia and Brazil and every nation on earth that has land where forests used to grow but are no longer there. This is a brave and terrifying confession from climate scientists because it totally undercuts their climate agenda. If hiring farmers and planting trees and growing those trees until they are massively huge could solve the problem of excess carbon dioxide, if we could eliminate all of the fossil fuel emissions and then some, then we would no longer need the climate movement. We would no longer need all those climate research grants. We would no longer need to spend trillions upon trillions of dollars on the climate agenda. Indeed, planting trees and erasing the excess carbon emissions might cause the dreadful and horrific catastrophe where wealthy donors no longer throw money at university sustainability departments. And in my efforts to solve the problem of excess carbon dioxide, I think it would be beneficial to step back and relax and admit to ourselves that most of those climate deniers would not exist and the problem would have already been solved, except for the fact that it is too painfully obvious that climate scientists over the last few decades really have taken advantage of this serious situation in order to pursue their own social agenda. Inside the very first climate declaration from the very first climate conference in 1979, where the problem of excess carbon dioxide was clearly identified and acknowledged, the solution that the climate scientists proposed and suggested actually included this kind of stuff: a world climate program, more research and studies and data and mathematical models, an analysis of different human societies, social and economic development, cooperation between nations, and world peace. I'm not saying that those social agenda things are necessarily bad or wrong, depending upon implementation, logistics, and cost, but when you have a critical situation of too much carbon dioxide in the air, and when you know the effects are going to be devastating, and when you know that planting billions of new trees will sequester billions of tons of carbon dioxide, then you should put your futuristic societal wishes on the back burner and start planting trees and sequester as much carbon dioxide as possible. The climate scientists in charge of their climate agenda did not do the right thing for humanity, and therefore it is completely understandable that some people do not trust anything the climate scientists might say. My estimate is that we need to grow 480 billion tons of new wood, which would sequester 768 billion tons of carbon dioxide inside the trees, and also would sequester 200 billion tons of carbon dioxide in the soil. And you could quibble with my numbers, but the end result is entirely dependent upon what specific tree species you would want to plant, and there are thousands of choices. As long as I'm preaching, I'm just going to suggest that humanity should seriously consider growing billions of tree crops, because that would sequester carbon dioxide, and our species is going to need the extra food someday soon. Since the Industrial Revolution, Earth has lost a staggering amount of forest land and a disastrous amount of trees. We need to reverse the trend. We need to spend money on a workable solution and stop wasting money on the climate movement's social agenda. We need to hire farmers and grow billions of large trees and protect those trees until they become old forests. And in doing so, we will save humanity from self-inflicted extinction. Thank you.